silence can be the loudest sound in an empty room. For Masaru Takeda, a Japanese billionaire lost in his towering fortress of glass and steel in San Francisco's financial district, that silence was deafening. The weight of 3 years without her voice had crushed his spirit into fragments. I don't know where you're listening from. Maybe you're looking at an old photograph or remembering someone you lost long ago. It doesn't matter what time it is, but I promise, today's story will touch your soul. The 42nd floor of the Takeda Tower offered a panoramic view of San Francisco Bay. But Masaru never looked anymore. His penthouse apartment stretched endlessly in minimalist perfection. Marble floors that reflected nothing but emptiness. Walls adorned with abstract paintings worth millions yet devoid of meaning. The scent of expensive leather furniture mixed with the sterile coolness of central air conditioning, creating an atmosphere that felt more like a mausoleum than a home. Against the eastern wall, a mahogany grandfather clock stood frozen at 3:15, the exact moment Fumiko had taken her last breath in his arms 3 years, 4 months, and 16 days ago. He had stopped it himself, unable to bear the thought of time moving forward without her. Every morning, Masaru's Italian leather shoes echoed against the marble as he walked past the empty chair where Fumiko used to sit with her morning tea, legs curled beneath her, reading poetry aloud in her gentle voice. The chair remained exactly as she had left it, a cashmere throw folded precisely over one arm, a bookmark still marking page 127 of her favorite Haruki Murakami novel. The morning light that once danced across her black hair now illuminated only dust particles floating in the stagnant air. His fortune, built through strategic investments in artificial intelligence and cryptocurrency, had grown exponentially, even in his grief. His portfolio boasted assets worth $8 billion, with holdings in Bitcoin alone exceeding 400 million. The irony wasn't lost on him. While his wealth multiplied through automated systems and algorithmic trading, his capacity for joy had withered to nothing. Money flowed through offshore accounts and hedge funds like digital rivers, but his heart remained as frozen as that clock on his wall. Board meetings blended into conference calls, stock reports into dividend statements, yet none of it mattered. Success without someone to share it with felt like wearing a crown in an empty kingdom. Masaru moved through his days like a ghost haunting his own life. His housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, came twice a week to maintain the pristine environment, but she worked in silence, understanding that her employer preferred the sound of vacuum cleaners to human conversation. The refrigerator was always stocked with imported delicacies, Kobe beef, organic vegetables, premium sake, but he barely tasted anything. Food had become mere fuel for a body that continued functioning despite his soul's departure. The penthouse kitchen, with its professional-grade appliances and marble countertops, remained largely untouched except for the coffee machine that brewed his single cup each morning. In the evenings, after the markets closed and his financial advisors updated him on the day's gains, always gains, never enough losses to feel anything, Masaru would stand before the floor-to-ceiling windows and watch the city lights twinkle below. San Francisco pulsed with life he no longer felt part of. Cars moved along the streets like glowing ants. People hurried along sidewalks with purpose he had forgotten. And somewhere in those neighborhoods, families gathered around dinner tables sharing stories and laughter that seemed as foreign to him as an ancient language. The master bedroom held the deepest silence. Fumiko's side of the bed remained untouched, her pillows still holding the faint impression of her head. Her cosmetics lined the bathroom counter exactly as she had arranged them. Her favorite perfume, a delicate blend of jasmine and sandalwood, still emanated from clothes hanging in the walk-in closet. Some nights, Masaru would lie on his side of the massive bed, staring at the empty space beside him, remembering how she used to steal his warmth by pressing her cold feet against his legs. The memory was so vivid he could almost feel her presence, but when he reached across the Egyptian cotton sheets, his hand met only cool fabric and crushing disappointment. On this particular Tuesday morning, as autumn fog rolled across the bay and through the Golden Gate Bridge, something shifted in Masaru's routine. Perhaps it was the way the filtered sunlight hit Fumiko's empty chair. Or maybe it was the realization that he hadn't left his building in 6 days, but he felt an inexplicable urge to walk. Not to another board meeting or business lunch, but simply to walk among the people whose lives continued moving forward while his remained suspended in time. He dressed in his usual attire, a charcoal gray suit tailored in Milan, shoes polished to mirror brightness, but instead of heading to his private garage, he took the elevator down to street level and stepped onto the sidewalk. The Mission District called to him without explanation. Perhaps it was because Fumiko had loved that neighborhood's vibrancy, its authentic taquerias and colorful murals, its sense of community that their wealthy enclave in the financial district lacked. The fog was lifting as his black sedan, he couldn't bring himself to walk that far, dropped him at 24th and Mission. The scent of corn tortillas and chili peppers filled the air, mixing with the sound of Spanish conversations and children's laughter echoing from nearby playgrounds. Street vendors called out their wares, their voices carrying the kind of enthusiasm Masaru remembered feeling once, long ago when closing his first $1 million deal had seemed impossible. He found himself standing outside Café Alma, a small coffee shop with mismatched chairs and tables worn smooth by countless conversations. Through the window he could see families sharing pastries, elderly men playing dominoes, young mothers bouncing babies on their hips while balancing laptops on tiny tables. Life in all its messy, beautiful complexity continued around him, but he remained separate, watching through glass like a visitor to an aquarium, observing a world he could see but not touch. That's when she appeared. A little girl no older than 8 emerged from the crowd like a small miracle wrapped in a faded pink jacket. Her name was Emmy, though Masaru wouldn't learn this until later. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail secured with an elastic band that had seen better days, and her sneakers bore the scuffs and stains that spoke of a childhood spent actually playing rather than posed for photographs. She moved with the unconscious grace of someone still connected to wonder, her dark eyes taking in the world with curiosity rather than judgment. Emmy's mother, Aya, worked double shifts at 2 different cleaning services to keep their small apartment in the Mission. While Aya scrubbed office buildings and wealthy homes, Emmy spent afternoons with her grandmother, a wise woman who had immigrated from Japan decades earlier and who understood that some lessons couldn't be taught, only absorbed through storytelling and presence. It was from her grandmother that Emmy had learned the old songs, the ancient wisdom, and the belief that every person carried both invisible wounds and hidden light. The afternoon was growing cool, and Masaru had been standing motionless on the sidewalk for nearly an hour, watching the flow of life around him like a man observing a river he no longer remembered how to cross. His expensive suit and polished shoes marked him as clearly as if he wore a sign reading, "Outsider." But Emmy saw something different. While others might have seen wealth and power, she noticed the way his shoulders curved inward, the way his eyes focused on nothing, the way he stood so still he might have been carved from stone. She approached him with the fearlessness that only children possess, carrying a paper flower she had crafted from colorful grocery store circulars, a small creation born from imagination rather than money. The flower was imperfect, its petals slightly uneven, its stem wrapped in Scotch tape, but it carried something his mansion full of expensive art lacked. It was made with love, given freely, expected nothing in return. "You look lonely," Emmy said, her voice soft but certain as she looked up at this tall man whose sadness seemed to radiate from him like heat from concrete. Her words were simple, spoken without calculation or agenda, yet they struck Masaru with the force of revelation. In all his years of business negotiations, corporate mergers, and financial strategies, no one had ever seen him clearly enough to speak such truth. The statement hung in the air between them, more powerful than any market analysis or quarterly report. Masaru felt something crack inside his chest, a fissure in the ice that had encased his heart since Fumiko's death. For 3 years he had surrounded himself with employees who called him Sir, advisors who praised his acumen, and acquaintances who envied his fortune. But none had noticed that beneath the success and wealth lived a man slowly drowning in his own grief. At first, Masaru's instinct was to retreat behind the familiar armor of his position and power. He looked down at this small girl with her homemade flower and attempted a smile that felt rusty from disuse. Lonely? He forced a chuckle that sounded hollow even to his own ears. I'm surrounded by millions. My investment portfolio grows every day. My companies employ thousands of people. I have more money than most people see in a lifetime. But Emmy wasn't impressed by numbers or intimidated by his status. She tilted her head slightly, studying him with the unguarded directness that children possess before the world teaches them to look away from uncomfortable truths. "But millions can't hug you," she replied, her voice carrying no trace of argument or disrespect, only gentle observation. "Money can't laugh with you when you're happy, or hold your hand when you're scared." Her words landed like physical blows, each one finding its mark in the hollow spaces of his chest. Masaru stood frozen, his mouth half open with a response that wouldn't come. How could this child, this stranger who knew nothing of his circumstances, see through the facade that had fooled everyone else? How could she articulate the very loneliness he had been trying so hard to deny? The businessman in him wanted to dismiss her as naive, to explain the complexities of adult life and the security that wealth provided, but something deeper. A part of him that had been silent since Fumiko's death recognized the truth in her simple words. All his Bitcoin holdings and stock dividends, his real estate investments and offshore accounts, the endless stream of zeros in his bank statements, none of it could fill the emptiness that had taken residence in his chest. Emmy extended the paper flower toward him, her small hand steady despite the weight of the moment. The flower trembled slightly in the cool San Francisco breeze, its bright colors a stark contrast to the gray suit and grayer expression of the man before her. "This is for you," she said. "My grandmother taught me that flowers can carry messages from the heart, even paper ones." Masaru stared at the offered gift, his mind racing through calculations that had nothing to do with profit margins or market volatility. When had someone last given him something that cost nothing but meant everything? His penthouse was filled with expensive artwork, designer furniture, and luxury items that served as trophies of his success, but none carried the simple generosity he saw in this crumpled paper creation. He reached out slowly, his manicured fingers closing around the makeshift stem with a gentleness that surprised him. The paper felt fragile against his skin, warm from the child's hands, and somehow more precious than the platinum watch on his wrist, or the diamond cufflinks at his sleeves. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the street noise. Emmy smiled then, a radiant expression that seemed to brighten the overcast afternoon, and for just a moment Masaru felt something stir in his chest, not the familiar ache of grief, but something lighter, warmer, almost forgotten. Hope, perhaps, or simply the recognition that somewhere in this vast, indifferent city, someone had seen his pain without judgment and offered kindness without condition. "I have to go now," Emmy said, glancing toward Café Alma where her grandmother was visible through the window, gesturing for her to return. "But maybe I'll see you again. This is where I like to play after school." She turned to leave, then paused and looked back at him. "What's your name?" "Masaru," he answered, surprised at how long it had been since someone had asked. "I'm Emmy. It means beautiful blessing in Japanese. My grandmother told me that." She waved with the unconscious confidence of someone who had never doubted that the world was fundamentally good, then skipped back toward the cafe, her faded sneakers splashing through small puddles left by the morning fog. Masaru stood alone on the sidewalk, holding a paper flower made from grocery store advertisements, feeling more awake than he had in 3 years. The weight of his grief hadn't lifted. It still pressed against his ribs like a physical thing. But for the first time since Fumiko's death, he wanted to take another breath, to see what the next moment might bring. The busy street around him continued its rhythm, but something fundamental had shifted in his personal universe. That evening, back in his penthouse fortress, Masaru placed Emi's paper flower in a crystal vase on his dining table, directly across from where Fumiko used to sit. The homemade creation looked absurd, surrounded by such expensive minimalism, like a wildflower growing through concrete. But it was the first thing in 3 years that he had chosen to display, not because of its monetary value, but because of its meaning. As he sat in his leather chair, staring at the paper petals that caught the light from his designer lamps, Masaru felt the first crack in the ice that had encased his heart since that terrible day when time stopped at 3:15. Somewhere across the city, a little girl named Emi was probably having dinner with her family, unaware that she had just performed the first miracle in the resurrection of a man who had forgotten how to live. The grandfather clock remained frozen, its hands still marking the moment of his greatest loss. But for the first time in years, Masaru began to wonder if time was ready to move forward again. The paper flower rustled slightly in the conditioned air, a whisper of possibility in the silence that had become his world. Over the following days, something impossible began happening in Masaru's carefully controlled existence. He found himself drawn back to the Mission District like a magnet pulled toward true north. It started as an accident, or so he told himself. On Wednesday, he instructed his driver to take a different route from a meeting, one that happened to pass by 24th and Mission. On Thursday, he walked out of a conference call early, claiming fatigue when what he really felt was an inexplicable need to breathe air that hadn't been filtered through corporate ventilation systems. By Friday, he had abandoned all pretense and asked his assistant to clear his afternoon schedule. "Personal business," he said, ignoring her surprised expression. In 3 years of working for him, Margaret had never known Masaru to have personal business that wasn't related to managing Fumiko's memorial fund or updating her will. The Mission District welcomed him back with its symphony of life. Children chasing soccer balls down narrow streets, elderly men playing chess in pocket parks, the scent of fresh tortillas mixing with diesel exhaust, and blooming jacaranda trees. Masaru found himself walking slower than usual, his businessman's hurried pace gradually adjusting to the neighborhood's more relaxed rhythm. His expensive shoes clicked against uneven sidewalks that told stories of decades of use, so different from the pristine marble floors of his corporate world. Café Alma became his anchor point. He would order a single coffee, nothing fancy, just the house blend that cost less than the imported water he drank in board meetings, and sit at a small table near the window, ostensibly reading financial reports on his tablet, but actually watching for a glimpse of a little girl with a gentle smile and wise eyes. Emi appeared on his third visit, emerging from the school bus that dropped children at the corner with all the chaos and joy that only groups of 8-year-olds could create. She was laughing with friends, her backpack bouncing as she ran, but when she spotted Masaru through the cafe window, she stopped mid-stride and waved with the enthusiasm of someone greeting an old friend rather than a virtual stranger she had met once on a sidewalk. She bounded into the cafe with permission from her grandmother, who watched from behind the counter where she worked part-time serving coffee and homemade pastries to supplement her daughter Aya's cleaning income. The older woman's eyes were cautious but kind as she observed this well-dressed man who had somehow captured her granddaughter's attention. "You kept the flower!" Emi exclaimed, sliding into the chair across from Masaru without invitation. Her school uniform was rumpled from a day of learning and playing, her hair escaping from its morning ponytail, but her eyes sparkled with the same light he remembered. "I thought maybe you would throw it away when you got home." "It's on my dining table," Masaru admitted, surprised by his own honesty. "In a crystal vase." Emi clapped her hands together in delight. "Really? A real vase? Like for fancy flowers?" "Like for the most important flower in my home," he said, the words emerging without conscious thought. They surprised him. When had he become someone who said such things? The old Masaru dealt in quarterly earnings and market projections, not paper flowers and emotional declarations. "Tell me about your home," Emi said, propping her chin on her hands with the complete attention that children give to subjects that fascinate them. "Is it very big? Do you have a garden? My grandmother has plants on our fire escape, but she says they're not really a garden, just hopes in pots. Masaru found himself describing his penthouse in ways he never had before, not as an asset worth millions or a symbol of his success, but as a place that echoed with silence, where rooms sat empty and windows stayed closed to keep the world at bay. He told her about the grandfather clock that had stopped, about Fumiko's chair that no one sat in, about the way his footsteps sounded too loud on the marble floors. Emmy listened without judgment, her young face serious as she absorbed his words. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, then reached across the table to pat his hand with her small fingers. "It sounds very lonely," she said softly, "but maybe it doesn't have to stay that way." "Some things can't be changed," Masaru replied. But even as he said it, he wondered if that was true. For 3 years, he had accepted his isolation as the natural consequence of loss, but Emmy's presence challenged that assumption simply by existing. "My grandmother says that everything can change if you let it," Emmy said, glancing toward the counter where her grandmother was wiping down the espresso machine with practiced efficiency. "She says hearts are like seeds. They need light and water and time to grow again, but they can always grow." Before Masaru could respond, Emmy stood up and walked to her grandmother, engaging in rapid Japanese that his rusty language skills could barely follow. He caught fragments, something about a sad man with a stopped clock, something about paper flowers and crystal vases, but the tone was clear. Emmy was advocating for something, her small hands gesturing expressively as she made her case. Her grandmother's response was gentle but firm, delivered in a mixture of Japanese and English that spoke to generations of adaptation. "Emmy-chan, some sadness is too big for little girls to fix." "But not too big for friendship," Emmy replied, switching to English as she looked back at Masaru. "Right, Oba-san. Friendship isn't about fixing, it's about being there." The older woman studied Masaru with eyes that had seen decades of human nature, evaluating not his expensive clothes or obvious wealth, but something deeper. Finally, she nodded slowly and walked over to their table, carrying a small plate with 2 homemade cookies that smelled of ginger and warmth. "I am Kimiko," she said, bowing slightly in the traditional manner despite the casual cafe setting. "Emmy has told me you have honored her gift. This is good. In Japan, we believe that gifts freely given must be freely received, or the circle of kindness breaks." Masaru stood and bowed in return, muscle memory from his childhood in Tokyo overriding his years of Western business protocol. "I am Masaru Takeda. Your granddaughter has shown me unexpected kindness." Kimiko's eyes widened slightly at his surname. In the Japanese community, even in San Francisco, the Takeda name was known. His grandfather had been among the early Japanese immigrants to California, building a small but successful fishing business before the war changed everything. But she said nothing about recognition, instead offering a small smile. "Kindness is never unexpected," she said. "Only unrecognized. Please sit." Emmy rarely speaks so enthusiastically about new friends. As they shared the ginger cookies, the first homemade food Masaru had tasted in years, Emmy chattered about school, her friends, her favorite games, and her dreams of becoming a veterinarian so she could help animals who were hurt or scared. Her grandmother interjected occasionally with gentle corrections or additions, but mostly she watched Masaru with the careful attention of someone who understood the weight of unspoken grief. "Do you have children, Takeda-san?" Kimiko asked during a lull in Emmy's storytelling. The question hit like a physical blow. "No," Masaru managed, his voice rougher than intended. "My wife and we wanted. But then she became ill, and there wasn't time." Kimiko nodded with the understanding of someone who had lived through her own share of losses. "Time is a strange gift," she said quietly. "Sometimes we think we have forever, and sometimes we discover that one moment can hold eternity." Emmy, with the intuitive sensitivity that some children possess, seemed to sense the adult conversation's darker undertones. She reached for Masaru's hand again, her small fingers warm against his skin. "Are you sad about your wife?" she asked with the directness that adults lose somewhere along the way to sophistication. "Yes," Masaru answered, because lying to those clear, honest eyes felt impossible. "It's okay to be sad," Emmy said seriously. "When my goldfish died, I cried for 3 days. Obasan said that crying is how love looks when it has nowhere to go." The simple wisdom of her words struck Masaru silent. In all his grief counseling sessions, all the condolence letters from business associates, all the professional sympathy he had received, no one had ever described his pain with such clarity. His tears were indeed love with nowhere to go, 3 years of accumulated affection with no recipient, daily habits of caring with no object, a heart full of devotion with no destination. As the afternoon wore on and other customers filtered in and out of the cafe, Masaru found himself relaxing in ways he had forgotten were possible. Emmy's presence was like sunlight after a long winter, not overwhelming or demanding, just persistently warm. She didn't try to cheer him up or offer solutions to his grief. Instead, she simply existed beside him, sharing stories and asking questions that had nothing to do with his wealth or business success. When it was time for Emmy to go home, she gave him another paper flower, this one crafted from the pages of a magazine and secured with a paperclip shaped like a star. "For your crystal vase," she said. "Now your important flower won't be lonely either." As Masaru walked back to his sedan, holding the second paper flower as carefully as if it were made of actual petals, he realized that something had shifted in his chest. The constant ache was still there, would probably always be there. But alongside it was something new. Not happiness exactly, but a kind of anticipation, a sense that tomorrow might hold something worth experiencing. That night he placed the second flower next to the first in the crystal vase. Together, they looked less absurd, more like an intentional arrangement. He found himself imagining what Fumiko would say about his paper bouquet, and for the first time, the thought made him smile rather than weep. She would have loved Emmy immediately, would have been charmed by the child's wisdom and warmed by her generous spirit. The grandfather clock still stood frozen at 3:15, its hands marking the end of one kind of time. But as Masaru looked at his paper flowers catching the light from San Francisco's glittering skyline, he began to wonder if a different kind of time was ready to begin. The following week brought an unexpected rhythm to Masaru's precisely ordered life. Tuesday afternoon found him back at Café Alma. Wednesday brought another visit. And by Thursday, he realized his assistant Margaret was having to reschedule meetings to accommodate what he vaguely referred to as community research. The truth was simpler and more complicated than any business strategy. He was becoming addicted to hope, finding in Emmy's presence something his billions couldn't purchase. Their friendship developed with the organic unpredictability of actual human connection rather than the calculated networking that had defined his professional relationships for decades. Emmy would arrive after school, sometimes alone, sometimes with friends who regarded Masaru with the frank curiosity that children direct toward any adult who exists outside their usual sphere. She never asked about his money or his cars or his penthouses, instead focusing on questions that revealed her genuine interest in him as a person. "What made you happy when you were my age?" she asked one afternoon as they shared a plate of Kimiko's homemade mochi, the sweet rice treats melting on their tongues like edible memories. Masaru had to reach back through decades of corporate achievements and financial milestones to remember the boy he had been in Tokyo, before ambition and tragedy had reshaped him. "Building things," he said slowly, surprised by the clarity of the memory. "I had a set of wooden blocks that my father brought back from a business trip. I would spend hours creating castles and bridges, entire cities that existed only in my imagination." "Do you still like to build things?" Emmy asked, licking mochi powder from her fingers with unselfconscious pleasure. "I suppose I do, in a way. I build companies now instead of castles. But it's different." He paused, trying to articulate a distinction he had never consciously considered. "The wooden blocks were just for joy. The companies are for other reasons." Emmy nodded as if this made perfect sense. My grandmother says that grown-ups sometimes forget the difference between doing things because they have to and doing things because they want to. She says it's important to remember both. Her grandmother, Kimiko, had become a quiet presence in these afternoon interludes. She would bring tea or cookies, exchange pleasantries, and then retreat to give them space, while remaining close enough to supervise. Masaru gradually understood that this wasn't distrust of him personally, but rather the protective instincts of a woman who had raised a granddaughter in a world that wasn't always safe for little girls, especially when wealthy men showed unexpected interest in their lives. The wisdom of this caution became clear when Aya, Emmy's mother, arrived at the cafe one Thursday afternoon, still wearing her cleaning service uniform and carrying the bone-deep exhaustion that comes from working multiple jobs while raising a child alone. She was petite like her daughter, but where Emmy radiated confident joy, Aya wore the wariness of someone who had learned to expect disappointment as often as hope. "You're the man Emmy talks about," she said without preamble, standing beside their table with her arms crossed in a posture that managed to be protective without being openly hostile. "The one with the big house and the stopped clock." Masaru stood immediately, his business training kicking in even though this was hardly a corporate negotiation. "I am Masaru Takeda. Your daughter has shown me great kindness." Aya studied him with tired but intelligent eyes, taking in his expensive suit, his polished shoes, his general aura of wealth and power. "What do you want with her?" she asked bluntly, cutting through the polite formalities that usually cushion such conversations. The question hung in the air, and Masaru realized he didn't have a ready answer. What did he want? Connection, certainly. The warmth of human contact. The strange peace that Emmy's presence brought to his wounded heart. But how could he explain this to a mother who worked herself to exhaustion to provide for her child, whose experience with wealthy men probably didn't include those who sought nothing but friendship from an 8-year-old girl? "I don't want anything," he said finally, and realized as he spoke that this was perhaps the first entirely truthful statement he had made about his motivations. "She gave me a paper flower when I needed kindness. I've been hoping to return the favor, I suppose." Aya's expression softened slightly, but her posture remained guarded. "Men like you always want something. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but eventually. And when they don't get it, people like us get hurt." The pain in her voice spoke of experience, of promises broken and trust betrayed, of a world where kindness often came with hidden price tags. Masaru felt a familiar frustration rising, the same helplessness he experienced when his wealth created barriers instead of bridges, when his success became a source of suspicion rather than respect. "Mama," Emmy interrupted, tugging on her mother's sleeve with the persistence of a child who sensed brewing conflict. "Masaru is sad like you are sometimes. But his sadness is different. It's bigger and older, and he doesn't know how to make it smaller." Both adults looked down at her in surprise. Emmy continued, her young voice carrying the matter-of-fact wisdom that children sometimes access without understanding its source. "He doesn't want to take anything from us. He just wants to not be so alone. Can't we let him be our friend? We have enough friendship to share." Aya stared at her daughter, then at Masaru, then back at Emmy. Something in her expression shifted, the protective anger giving way to a different kind of concern. "Emmy, baby, it's not that simple. Friendship between grown-ups and children has to have boundaries." "What kind of boundaries?" Emmy asked, genuinely curious. Before Aya could answer, Kimiko approached their table carrying a pot of tea and wearing the diplomatic expression of someone who had witnessed this conversation developing and decided intervention was necessary. "Aya-chan," she said gently, using the familiar suffix that spoke to their close relationship. "Perhaps we should discuss this properly, with tea and time to think clearly." What followed was the most unusual business negotiation of Masaru's career, though it bore no resemblance to any boardroom discussion he had ever experienced. Sitting around a table made for two, but somehow accommodating four, with Emmy coloring quietly beside them, and Kimiko serving tea with the ceremonial precision of someone honoring old traditions. They worked out the parameters of an unlikely friendship. Aya's concerns were practical and heartfelt. She worried about Emmy becoming attached to someone whose life was so different from theirs, about the child learning to expect luxuries they couldn't provide, about the inevitable day when Masaru would move on and leave Emmy feeling abandoned. Her questions were sharp but fair. What happened when he got bored? What happened if his interest in Emmy made other people uncomfortable? What happened when the novelty of playing benefactor wore off? Masaru found himself answering with honesty that surprised him. He talked about the silence in his penthouse, about how Emmy's laughter had become the brightest part of his week, about the way her questions made him remember parts of himself he had thought permanently lost. He admitted that he didn't know where this strange friendship would lead, but that for the first time in 3 years, he looked forward to something besides the end of each day. "I'm not trying to replace anything or anyone in her life," he said, watching Emmy add purple flowers to a drawing that appeared to depict their table at Café Alma. "I'm just grateful that she sees something in me worth her time." Kimiko spoke into the thoughtful silence that followed. "In Japan, we have a concept called ikigai, the reason for being. For 3 years, Takeda-san has existed without ikigai, living but not truly alive. Emmy has reminded him that life contains purposes beyond profit. This is a gift we can choose to honor or reject, but we cannot pretend it is unimportant." The negotiation concluded with agreements that felt both formal and organic. Masaru could continue visiting the cafe on weekday afternoons, but only when either Kimiko or Aya was present. He could bring small gifts, books, art supplies, educational games, but nothing expensive enough to create unrealistic expectations about material wealth. He could share stories about his life and travels, but he wasn't to make promises about future opportunities or advantages he might provide. Most importantly, if Emmy ever seemed uncomfortable or if her schoolwork or home life suffered, the friendship would end immediately. "These sound like rules for parole," Masaru said with a wry smile, but he was signing the invisible contract even as he spoke. "I accept them gladly." As they prepared to leave, Aya lingered beside his chair while Emmy gathered her backpack and Kimiko cleared the tea service. "She's all I have," Aya said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of single motherhood and economic uncertainty. "I work 60 hours a week cleaning other people's homes so she can have better chances than I did. I can't let anyone hurt her, no matter how good their intentions seem." "I understand," Masaru replied, and realized that he genuinely did. For the first time in years, he felt the fierce protectiveness that comes from caring about someone else's welfare more than your own convenience. "I promise you I will never be the source of her pain if I can help it." Aya searched his face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Okay, but remember, trust is earned in drops and lost in buckets. Don't make me regret this." That evening, Masaru sat in his penthouse, looking at the 2 paper flowers in their crystal vase, and thinking about boundaries and trust, and the strange mathematics of human connection. His portfolio had gained another $12 million during trading hours, numbers that flickered across his computer screen like abstract art. But the memory that lingered was Emmy's drawing of their cafe table, complete with tiny figures that he recognized as themselves sharing tea and conversation. The grandfather clock still stood frozen at 3:15, but time was moving forward in ways that couldn't be measured by mechanical hands. For the first time since Fumiko's death, Masaru fell asleep not to the sound of silence, but to the echo of a little girl's laughter and the promise of tomorrow's possibilities. As autumn deepened and the fog rolled more frequently across San Francisco Bay, the unlikely friendship between a billionaire and a little girl settled into something that neither could have predicted but both had somehow needed. Their afternoon meetings at Café Alma became anchors in their respective weeks, fixed points of warmth and connection that defied the logic of their vastly different circumstances. Emmy threw herself into their friendship with the wholehearted enthusiasm that children bring to things that capture their imagination. She saved interesting leaves from the playground to show Masaru, shared stories about her classmates and teachers with the confident assumption that he would find them as fascinating as she did, and asked questions that revealed both her intelligence and her genuine interest in understanding the adult world without being in any hurry to join it. "Why did you stop the clock?" she asked one gray afternoon as they sat sharing a slice of Kimiko's apple cake. The question emerged from nowhere, as her most penetrating observations often did, catching Masaru unprepared for its emotional directness. He had told her about Fumiko several weeks earlier, sharing the basic facts of loss without delving into the devastating details of watching someone you love disappear piece by piece while medical bills absorbed millions of dollars and international specialists offered nothing but expensive failures. But Emmy had apparently been thinking about the stopped clock since their first conversation, turning it over in her mind like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit. "Because I didn't want time to move forward without her," Masaru answered, surprised by how easily the truth emerged in Emmy's presence. It felt wrong that the world should continue when she was gone. Emmy considered this with the seriousness she brought to important matters. "But time moved anyway," she observed. "Even with the clock stopped, you still got older, right? And sad days still became less sad days, and seasons still changed?" "Yes," he admitted. "Time kept moving. I just pretended it didn't." "My grandmother says that stopping a clock is like closing your eyes to make the sun go away," Emmy said, taking another bite of apple cake. "The sun stays there whether you see it or not. Maybe the clock wants to tick again." Her words lodged somewhere deep in Masaru's chest, not as criticism, but as gentle observation. That night, he stood before the mahogany grandfather clock for the first time in 3 years, studying its ornate face and remembering the day Fumiko had insisted they buy it despite his protests about its old-fashioned presence in their modern home. She had wound it every Sunday, enjoying the ritual and the steady heartbeat it added to their quiet evenings together. His hand hovered over the pendulum, muscles remembering the motion even after years of stillness, but he couldn't quite bring himself to set time in motion again. Not yet. But the possibility hung in the air like a promise waiting for the right moment to be fulfilled. Meanwhile, Emmy's influence was creating other subtle changes in the sterile perfection of his penthouse. He found himself opening windows to let in fresh air and natural light, even when the San Francisco fog made the view less than spectacular. The rigid meal schedules his housekeeper maintained began to incorporate the foods Emmy had introduced him to. Simple comfort dishes like miso soup and onigiri rice balls that connected him to childhood memories he had buried beneath decades of corporate dining and business lunches. Most significantly, he began to hear his home differently. Where once the marble floors had echoed only with his footsteps and the silence of empty rooms, now he noticed other sounds: the hum of the city below, the whisper of wind against windows, the distant call of foghorns from the bay. The penthouse was still too large and too quiet for one person, but it no longer felt like a tomb. At the cafe, their conversations ranged across territories that Masaru's usual social interactions never explored. Emmy was fascinated by his travels, especially his descriptions of boardrooms in Tokyo skyscrapers and conference halls in European capitals. But she was equally interested in smaller details: what breakfast was like in different countries, whether people in other cities were as friendly as San Francisco neighbors, how it felt to fly above clouds when you were traveling to important meetings. "Do you miss Japan?" she asked one afternoon, as they watched her grandmother demonstrate the proper way to fold origami cranes from colorful paper. "Sometimes," Masaru answered, accepting a sheet of red paper and trying to remember the creases he had learned as a child. "I miss the sounds of my neighborhood in Tokyo, the way shopkeepers would call out greetings in the morning, the festivals with lanterns and music. But I've been in San Francisco longer than I lived in Japan now. This is home." "But it's a lonely home," Emmy observed, not as criticism, but as simple fact. "It has been," he agreed, "but maybe it doesn't have to stay that way." Kimiko looked up from her nearly perfect crane and smiled at the exchange. Over the weeks, she had become Masaru's quiet ally, understanding perhaps better than Aya the healing potential of their unusual friendship. Having lived through her own losses, a husband who died young, the struggle of raising children while working multiple jobs, the challenge of maintaining cultural identity while adapting to American life, she recognized the signs of someone learning to rejoin the world of the living. The breakthrough came on a particularly gray Thursday when Amy arrived at the cafe unusually subdued, her usual bright chatter replaced by thoughtful quiet. She colored while Masaru worked on his laptop, occasionally glancing up at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Finally, as Kimiko was preparing to close the cafe for the evening, Emi spoke. "Masaru, do you think your wife would like me?" The question caught him completely off guard. In all their conversations, Emi had never directly connected herself to Fumiko, never asked about her place in the larger story of his life and loss. The query revealed a depth of consideration that reminded him how carefully children observe the adult world, how much they understand even when they seem focused on their own immediate concerns. "She would love you," he said without hesitation, and realized as he spoke that this wasn't just a kind fabrication meant to comfort a child's insecurity. It was absolutely true. Fumiko would have been charmed by Emi's wisdom, delighted by her creativity, moved by her generous spirit. "She would think you were exactly the kind of friend I needed." Emi nodded as if this confirmed something she had already suspected. "I think she sent me to find you," she said matter-of-factly, the way she might announce that it was raining or that she was hungry. Not like a ghost or anything scary, just like how sometimes when you need something, it appears where you can find it. The words hung in the air between them, neither mystical nor dismissible, but carrying the kind of truth that children sometimes access without questioning its source. Masaru felt something shift in his chest. Not the crack of breaking, but the gentle movement of pieces settling into new alignment. That night he called Margaret and asked her to research community centers and children's programs in the Mission District. "I want to understand what resources are available for families in the area," he explained, not mentioning that his interest was both general and very specific. "Is this related to a new philanthropic initiative?" Margaret asked, clearly intrigued by this departure from his usual business focus. "Perhaps," Masaru said, realizing that he was beginning to see possibilities beyond his personal healing. "Let's call it preliminary research for now." As he hung up the phone and looked out at San Francisco's glittering skyline, Masaru reflected on how fundamentally his perspective had changed in just a few months. The same city lights that had once seemed like distant reminders of a world he no longer belonged to now looked like connections. Thousands of families having dinner, children doing homework, grandmothers telling stories, people living the messy, beautiful, ordinary miracle of human life. The paper flowers in their crystal vase had multiplied as Emi continued bringing him new creations, each one unique, none particularly artistic by conventional standards, all precious beyond measure. They formed a bouquet that no amount of money could have purchased, gifts freely given by someone who expected nothing in return except the pleasure of his company and the knowledge that her kindness had found its mark. The grandfather clock still stood frozen at 3:15, but Masaru found himself thinking about it differently now, not as a permanent memorial to the moment time stopped, but as a reminder that eventually even stopped time could choose to move forward again. Winter arrived early in San Francisco that year, bringing with it rain-soaked mornings and the kind of bone-deep chill that made Café Alma's warmth feel even more precious. Masaru found himself looking forward to their afternoon meetings with an anticipation that surprised him, not just for Emi's companionship, but for the larger sense of belonging that the cafe had begun to represent. But December also brought complications that neither of them had anticipated. The first sign of trouble came when Emi arrived at the cafe one particularly wet Thursday looking unusually tired, her usual bouncing energy replaced by quiet sniffles and a cough that she tried to hide behind her sleeve. Masaru noticed immediately, his concern sharpened by the protective instincts that had developed over their months of friendship. "Are you feeling well?" he asked, as she settled into her usual chair, noting the slight flush in her cheeks and the way she seemed smaller somehow, hunched inside her winter jacket. "Just a little cold," Emmy said, but her voice carried a raspiness that suggested something more significant than seasonal sniffles. "Mama says everyone gets sick when the weather changes." Kimiko appeared with a cup of warm tea flavored with honey and ginger, her grandmother's intuition clearly picking up on the same warning signs that had caught Masaru's attention. "Drink this slowly, Emmy-chan," she said, placing a gentle hand on her granddaughter's forehead. "And maybe we should call your mama to come get you early today." But Emmy protested with enough spirit to suggest that whatever was brewing hadn't fully taken hold yet, and they settled into their usual routine of coloring and quiet conversation. Masaru found himself watching her more carefully than usual, noting when she paused to cough or when she seemed to drift into daydreams that were less focused than her typical sharp attention to their discussions. "Tell me about winter in Tokyo," she requested, wrapping her small hands around the warm teacup as if drawing strength from its heat. "Was it very different from here?" Masaru described the snow that would dust the city streets, the way neighborhood children would build snowmen in tiny urban parks, the winter festivals with their paper lanterns casting colored light across frozen ground. But he found himself editing the stories as he spoke, focusing on warmth and comfort, rather than the cold and isolation that winter could bring, instinctively protecting her from images that might intensify whatever illness was taking hold. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Aya, who burst through the cafe door carrying the tension of someone who had received an urgent call at work. Her cleaning service uniform was damp from rain, her hair escaping from its professional ponytail, and her expression held the particular worry that only mothers understand, the fear that transforms any deviation from normal into potential catastrophe. "How is she?" Aya asked Kimiko without preamble, her eyes immediately finding Emmy at their corner table. "Tired. A little warm. The cough is getting worse," Kimiko replied quietly. "I think it's time to take her home." What followed was a brief but intense negotiation between grandmother and mother about the appropriate level of concern, conducted in rapid Japanese that excluded Masaru from all but the emotional undertones. He could see Aya's exhaustion warring with her protective instincts. She couldn't afford to miss work for minor childhood illnesses, but she couldn't ignore signs that this might be more serious than a simple cold. Emmy, meanwhile, had begun to droop visibly, the energy required to seem fine finally exceeding her reserves. She coughed again, a harsh sound that made all three adults exchange glances of shared concern. "I should take her to the clinic," Aya decided, but her voice carried undertones of financial anxiety, urgent care visits, prescription medications, potential lost workdays, all the cascading costs that working families juggle when medical needs arise. "Let me help," Masaru said quietly, the words emerging before he fully considered their implications. "Please, I have a driver outside. Let me take you both to whatever doctor you prefer, or to the hospital if that seems better." Aya's automatic rejection died on her lips as she looked at her daughter's flushed face and heard another harsh cough. Pride warred briefly with practicality, but maternal concern won. "The Children's Hospital on California Street," she said, "if you're sure." The ride to UCSF Benioff Children's Hospital took place mostly in silence, with Emi dozing against her mother's shoulder while Masaru watched San Francisco's rain-slicked streets blur past the sedan's windows. He found himself praying to gods he hadn't addressed in years, making bargains with the universe that he knew were probably futile but felt necessary anyway. Let her be okay. Let this be nothing more than a winter cold that looks worse than it is. Let me not lose this small light that has brought warmth back to my world. At the hospital, Masaru's presence and obvious wealth cut through normal waiting room delays with disturbing efficiency. Within minutes, Emmy was being examined by pediatric specialists, while Masaru and Aya sat in a family consultation room, surrounded by cheerful wall murals that felt absurdly inappropriate for their level of anxiety. "You don't have to stay," Aya said, but her voice lacked conviction. She was holding herself together through sheer maternal determination, but the hospital environment had clearly amplified all her worst fears about what might be wrong with her daughter. "I want to stay," Masaru replied, realizing that this was perhaps the most honest statement he had made in years. "If that's all right with you." The diagnosis, when it came, was both better and worse than their fears had suggested. Not a simple cold, but pneumonia. Bacterial, thankfully, which meant antibiotics could help, but serious enough to require hospitalization for several days while her small lungs cleared and her fever broke. As the doctor explained treatment plans and insurance procedures, Masaru watched Aya's face cycle through relief, worry, and practical calculation. Even with her cleaning service's basic health coverage, a multi-day hospital stay would create financial pressures that a family already living paycheck to paycheck couldn't easily absorb. "I'll take care of the costs," Masaru said quietly during a moment when the medical staff had stepped out to prepare Emi's room assignment. "All of them. Please don't worry about money right now." Aya looked at him with eyes that held gratitude and wariness in equal measure. "I can't let you pay for this. It's too much." "It's nothing," Masaru said, but immediately regretted the phrase when he saw her flinch. Of course it wasn't nothing to her. It represented perhaps months of her salary, opportunities foregone, sacrifices that would ripple through their family's life for years. "I mean, it's important to me that she gets well. Please let me help in the way I'm able to help." The conversation was interrupted by a nurse calling them back to Emi's room, where she lay propped up in a hospital bed that made her look even smaller than usual, oxygen tubes in her nose and IV lines snaking from her thin arms to machines that beeped with mechanical reassurance. But her eyes were still bright when she saw them, and she managed a weak smile that hit Masaru like a physical blow. "This is more exciting than the cafe," she whispered, her voice roughened by illness but still carrying traces of her characteristic optimism. "Do you think they have coloring books here?" Over the next 3 days, Masaru discovered aspects of himself that years of corporate success hadn't revealed. He spent hours in uncomfortable hospital chairs, learning the rhythms of pediatric wards and the particular anxiety that comes from watching someone you care about struggle with something beyond your ability to fix. His expensive suits became wrinkled from sleeping in waiting room chairs. His usually perfect grooming suffered as he forgot to shave or change shirts, too focused on Emi's fluctuating temperature and the gradual improvement in her breathing. Aya worked around his presence with the efficiency of someone adapting to unexpected circumstances. She couldn't take time off from both her jobs, but she rearranged schedules to be present during crucial medical consultations and to spend evenings reading to Emi or helping her with simple activities that didn't tax her recovering lungs. The three of them developed an unspoken partnership focused entirely on Emi's well-being, their usual boundaries suspended in the face of more important priorities. On the second night, as Emi slept peacefully for the first time since her admission, Aya and Masaru found themselves alone in the family lounge, sharing vending machine coffee that tasted like liquid cardboard, but provided necessary caffeine for another long vigil. "You don't have children," Aya said. Not a question, but an observation spoken with the authority of someone who recognized the particular quality of his concern for Emi. "But you love her." "Yes," Masaru admitted, the words feeling both foreign and completely natural. "I didn't expect to, but yes, she changed everything about how I understand the world." Aya nodded slowly. "She has that effect on people. Even her teachers say she's special. Not academically gifted, exactly, but emotionally wise in ways that surprise adults." She paused, studying her reflection in the coffee's dark surface. "I've been afraid of letting her get too attached to you because I thought you would eventually leave and she would be heartbroken. But watching you these past few days, I think maybe I was wrong about your intentions." "I'm not going anywhere," Masaru said, realizing as he spoke that this represented a commitment he had never consciously made, but which felt absolutely true. "Whatever she needs, whatever you both need, I want to help if you'll let me." The miracle, when it came, wasn't dramatic or sudden. Simply the gradual return of Emmy's natural energy, the clearing of her labored breathing, the restoration of her appetite and curiosity about the world around her. By the fourth day, she was demanding to go home, frustrated by the limitations of hospital routine and eager to return to the familiar rhythms of school and cafe visits. The morning of her discharge brought San Francisco's version of winter sunshine, pale but warm, filtering through the hospital room windows and highlighting the dozens of get-well cards from her classmates that had accumulated on her bedside table. Emmy sat on the edge of her bed, dressed in regular clothes for the first time in days, swinging her legs and chattering about everything she wanted to do when she got home. "Will you still come to the cafe?" she asked Masaru as they waited for final discharge paperwork, the question carrying more weight than its casual phrasing suggested. "If your mother and grandmother don't mind, I'd like to keep coming," he answered. "I've gotten used to our Thursday afternoons." Emmy beamed with satisfaction, but before she could respond, her expression suddenly grew thoughtful. "Masaru, while I was sick, did you think about your wife?" The question caught him unprepared, as her most perceptive observations always did. "Yes," he said. "I thought about how scared she must have been when she was in the hospital, and how I couldn't make her better no matter how much money I spent on doctors." "But you made me better," Emmy said with the matter-of-fact certainty that children bring to emotional truths. "Not medical better. The doctors did that. But you stayed, and you worried, and you cared. That's a different kind of better." As they left the hospital and emerged into the crisp December afternoon, Masaru found himself thinking about time and healing, about the ways that love manifests and transforms, about the possibility that maybe, just maybe, frozen hearts could learn to beat again. That evening, alone in his penthouse for the first time in days, he approached the mahogany grandfather clock with steady hands and a clear sense of purpose. The mechanism resisted briefly, stiff from years of stillness, but then the pendulum began to swing and time resumed its ancient rhythm. 3:16. 3:17. 3:18. Each tick carrying him further from the moment when everything stopped and closer to whatever came next. The sound filled his empty rooms with something he had almost forgotten, the heartbeat of a home where time moved forward and anything was possible. Spring arrived in San Francisco with its usual dramatic flair, transforming the city from winter's gray palette into an explosion of blooming cherry trees and bright California poppies. For Masaru, the seasonal change carried additional significance. It marked almost a year since that first afternoon when a little girl with wise eyes had approached him outside Café Alma and changed the trajectory of his carefully controlled existence. The changes in his life had accelerated after Emmy's illness, as if her recovery had given him permission to embrace transformation more fully. The grandfather clock ticked steadily in his penthouse, marking time that now held purpose beyond mere survival. His housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, had noticed the gradual warming of the previously sterile space. Windows remained open to let in fresh air and natural sounds. The refrigerator contained ingredients for actual meals rather than just expensive convenience foods, and the spare bedrooms had been converted from storage spaces into something resembling guest quarters, as if he was finally admitting the possibility that someone might visit. But the most significant changes were happening beyond the walls of his home. The preliminary research into Mission District community resources had evolved into something much more substantial, a comprehensive plan to establish a community center that would provide after-school programs, educational support, and family services for the neighborhood's working families. The project represented the largest financial commitment Masaru had made since Fumiko's death, but it felt less like charity and more like investment in the community that had given him back his sense of purpose. "You're sure about this?" his financial advisor had asked during their last meeting, reviewing the portfolio adjustments necessary to fund the initiative. "It's a substantial commitment, and community projects don't offer the same returns as your traditional investments. Some returns can't be measured in dollars, Masaru had replied, surprised by his own certainty. This is the right use of resources that have been sitting idle for too long. The community center project had brought him into regular contact with Aya, whose practical knowledge of the neighborhood's needs made her an invaluable consultant for the planning process. Their relationship had evolved from mutual wariness to genuine friendship, based on shared concern for Emmy's well-being and growing respect for each other's different forms of strength. Aya had left one of her cleaning jobs to work part-time as the center's community outreach coordinator, a position that utilized her multilingual skills and deep neighborhood connections, while providing better hours and more stable income than her previous employment. "I never expected to like you," she had told him during one of their planning meetings, her characteristic honesty delivered without malice. "Rich men usually want to fix everything with money, but they don't understand that some problems need time and attention, not just cash." "What changed your mind?" Masaru had asked, genuinely curious about her assessment. "You listen," she said simply, "and you don't expect gratitude for doing what anyone should do if they have the resources. You just do it." Meanwhile, Emmy had recovered completely from her winter illness, returning to her role as the heart of their unlikely constellation with energy that seemed brighter for having been temporarily dimmed. She threw herself into helping plan the community center with the enthusiasm she brought to all projects that captured her imagination, drawing elaborate blueprints that included essential features like a room specifically for making paper flowers and a kitchen big enough for community dinners. Their Thursday afternoon meetings at Café Alma had resumed, but they were joined now by other children from the neighborhood who had been drawn into Emmy's orbit and, by extension, into friendship with the quiet man in expensive suits who listened to their stories and remembered their names. Masaru found himself learning about homework struggles and playground dynamics, family celebrations and cultural traditions that had never intersected with his previous existence. The shift in his perspective was perhaps most evident in how he approached his business responsibilities. Where once he had focused exclusively on profit margins and market expansion, he now found himself asking different questions about his company's impacts on their employees and communities. Board meetings that had once been entirely about maximizing shareholder value began including discussions of family-friendly policies and educational partnerships. His executive team had adjusted to their CEO's new priorities with the flexible pragmatism that successful businesses require, though Masaru suspected that some of the changes were attributed to grief-related instability rather than genuine transformation. But the most profound change was internal. The gradual dissolution of the ice that had encased his heart since Fumiko's death. It wasn't that the grief had disappeared, it remained a permanent part of his emotional landscape, but it was no longer the only feature. Alongside the sadness lived appreciation for Fumiko's memory, gratitude for the time they had shared, and growing capacity for new forms of love and connection. This internal shift became visible in late spring, when Emmy made an observation that crystallized everything he had been feeling but couldn't articulate. They were sitting in Dolores Park on an unusually warm May afternoon, sharing ice cream and watching families enjoy the sunshine, when she asked, "Do you still miss your wife?" "Every day," Masaru answered truthfully. "But it's different now. Before, missing her felt like drowning. Now it feels like remembering something beautiful that I'm grateful I experienced." Emmy nodded as if this made perfect sense. "My grandmother says that love doesn't end when people die. It just finds new ways to exist. Maybe your wife's love turned into friendship with us." The simplicity of her words held depths that more sophisticated philosophical discussions had failed to reach. Love finding new ways to exist, transforming rather than ending, creating connections that honor the past while embracing the present. It was exactly what had happened, though he had never thought to describe it in such terms. "I think you're right," he said, watching her methodically work her way through a strawberry ice cream cone. "I think she would be happy about our friendship. I know she would." Emmy replied with the confident certainty that had characterized her observations from their very first meeting. "Because you smile now, and you laugh sometimes, and you're not so lonely that it hurts to look at." That evening, as Masaru prepared for sleep in his penthouse that no longer felt like a mausoleum, he realized that somewhere along the way he had begun building a new life rather than simply enduring the remainder of his old one. The community center would open in the fall, providing a concrete legacy of his transformation that would outlast his own lifetime. His relationships with Emmy, Aya, and Kimiko had given him the family structure he had never expected to experience without biological children. His business interests had evolved to reflect values beyond pure profit maximization. Most importantly, he had learned to carry Fumiko's memory as a source of strength, rather than paralyzing grief. She remained part of his daily existence, but no longer as the ghost-haunting empty rooms. Instead, as the foundation that had prepared him to recognize and receive the gifts that Emmy and her family had offered. The grandfather clock ticked steadily in the living room, its hands moving past 3:15 without notice, marking time that moved forward with purpose and measured moments filled with possibility rather than just endurance. As summer approached and the community center construction began, Masaru reflected on the strange mathematics of transformation. How one small act of kindness could multiply into changes that affected entire families, entire neighborhoods, entire ways of understanding what made life worth living. Emmy's paper flower, made from grocery store advertisements and secured with a paperclip, had been worth more than all his Bitcoin holdings and stock portfolios combined, because it had been the catalyst that restored his capacity to invest in futures beyond his own survival. The irony wasn't lost on him that his greatest return on investment had come from the one thing he had never tried to purchase: the unconditional love of a little girl who saw past his wealth to the wounded man beneath, and who had given him the gift of believing that even stopped hearts could learn to beat again. 2 years had passed since that first paper flower, and as Masaru stood in the nearly completed community center on a warm August morning, he marveled at how completely his life had been reconstructed. The building hummed with pre-opening activity, contractors applying final touches, staff members arranging furniture, volunteers organizing supplies for the dozens of programs that would begin serving neighborhood families within the week. The center itself was a testament to collaborative vision rather than individual philanthropy. While Masaru's financial resources had made the project possible, its design and programming reflected months of community input and professional expertise. The building featured bright classrooms equipped with the latest educational technology, a commercial kitchen for cooking classes and community meals, a small healthcare clinic staffed by volunteer medical professionals, and a large multi-purpose room that could accommodate everything from job training workshops to cultural celebrations. Emmy, now 10 years old and officially the center's youngest advisory council member, moved through the space with proprietary pride, pointing out features she had suggested, and explaining the intended use of various rooms to visitors. Her enthusiasm was infectious, drawing adults into her excitement about the after-school tutoring program, the senior citizens' lunch gatherings, and the weekend family activities that would soon fill the center with the sounds of community life. "This is where we'll have the paper flower workshop," she announced to Masaru as they toured the arts and crafts room together. "I'm going to teach other kids how to make them, and we'll give them to people who look lonely, just like I did with you." The comment struck Masaru with unexpected force, not because it was sentimental, but because it revealed how naturally Emmy had absorbed the lesson of their friendship, that kindness multiplied when shared, that healing happened through connection, that small gestures could catalyze transformations beyond anyone's ability to predict or control. Aya appeared in the doorway, carrying a clipboard, and wearing the focused expression of someone coordinating multiple complex logistics simultaneously. Her role as community outreach coordinator had evolved into something closer to assistant director, as her bilingual skills, neighborhood relationships, and practical wisdom made her indispensable to the center's operations. The position provided not just better income than her previous cleaning jobs, but also the professional satisfaction of work that matched her capabilities and interests. "The food delivery truck is here," she informed them, "and the volunteer orientation starts in an hour. Emmy, your grandmother wants you to help arrange the welcome packets." As Emmy scampered off to assist Kimiko, who had become the center's unofficial cultural advisor and cooking instructor, Aya lingered beside Masaru, both of them watching the bustle of preparation with the satisfaction of shared accomplishment. "Are you nervous about opening day?" she asked. "Terrified," Masaru admitted. "What if we built something the community doesn't actually want? What if all our planning was based on assumptions that turn out to be wrong?" Aya smiled at his anxiety. "Then we'll adjust and try again. That's what communities do. They adapt to serve their members' real needs rather than their imagined ones." She paused, studying his expression. "You know, you've become much more human since I first met you." "What do you mean?" he asked, genuinely curious about her assessment. "When you first started visiting the cafe, you seemed like someone playing a role. The successful businessman, the grieving widower, the philanthropist considering charity work. Now you just seem like yourself, whoever that turns out to be." Her words resonated because they captured something he had been feeling but couldn't articulate, a sense that he was finally inhabiting his own life rather than performing a version of it for external audiences. The community center project had revealed aspects of his personality and values that had been dormant during his years of pure business focus, qualities that Fumiko had loved, but that had been buried beneath grief and isolation after her death. The center's opening celebration took place on a perfect September Saturday, with the kind of crystalline autumn light that made San Francisco feel like the most beautiful city in the world. Families arrived carrying covered dishes for the community potluck. Children ran through the building exploring every corner with delighted curiosity, and elderly residents settled into comfortable chairs to observe the festivities, with the satisfaction of people seeing their neighborhood gain a valuable resource. Masaru had insisted that there be no formal dedication ceremony or speeches about his financial contribution. This was the community center, not a monument to his philanthropy, and he preferred to remain in the background, watching the interactions and connections that the space was designed to facilitate. But Emmy had other ideas about appropriate recognition. During the informal program that followed the shared meal, she climbed onto a small stage in the multi-purpose room and asked for everyone's attention with the confident authority she had developed through her role as the center's youngest advocate. "I want to tell you about paper flowers," she began, her clear voice carrying easily through the room. "2 years ago, I made one from grocery store papers and gave it to a man who looked very lonely. He kept it, and it grew into—" She gestured to encompass the entire building. "All of this. My grandmother says that every act of kindness is like planting a seed, but you never know how big the tree will grow until it's already growing." She paused, scanning the audience until she found Masaru standing against the back wall, attempting to remain inconspicuous among the crowd of parents and children. "Masaru taught me that grown-ups sometimes forget how to believe in possibilities, but when they remember, they can create miracles." The applause that followed was warm and appreciative, but what moved Masaru most was the way people looked at him afterward, not with the deference his wealth usually commanded, or the pity his widowhood sometimes attracted, but with simple acceptance as a member of their community who had contributed his resources and energy to their shared well-being. As the celebration wound down, and families began gathering their belongings and tired children, Masaru found himself alone in the arts and crafts room, straightening supplies and absorbing the profound satisfaction of seeing a vision become reality. The space smelled like fresh paint and new furniture, but already carried traces of the human activity that would soon make it feel lived in and purposeful. Emmy appeared in the doorway, no longer the energetic host, but showing signs of the exhaustion that followed intense social events. She carried a paper flower, not one of her characteristic grocery store creations, but an elaborate construction made from tissue paper in multiple colors, clearly crafted with more skill than her earlier attempts. "This is for you," she said, settling into the chair beside him with the comfortable familiarity of someone who had never needed permission to claim his attention, to celebrate the center, and to say thank you for listening when I told you that you looked lonely." Masaru accepted the flower with hands that trembled slightly, remembering the first time she had offered him such a gift, and how foreign the gesture had seemed to someone who had forgotten that presents could be given without expectations of equivalent return. This flower was more sophisticated than her early efforts, its multiple layers creating depth and texture that caught the afternoon light filtering through the room's windows. "It's beautiful," he said, and meant it completely. "I have a place of honor for it at home." "The crystal vase?" Emmy asked with a smile. "The crystal vase?" he confirmed. They sat together in comfortable silence, surrounded by the echoes of laughter and conversation that had filled the building throughout the day, both of them processing the magnitude of what had been accomplished and what lay ahead. The community center represented just the beginning, a foundation for programs and services that would evolve based on families' changing needs, a gathering place that would host celebrations and support people through difficulties, a symbol of what became possible when resources met genuine care for community welfare. "Do you still miss your wife?" Emmy asked, the question delivered with the same gentle directness that had characterized their first conversation. "I always will," Masaru answered. "But now when I think about her, I also think about you and your family and this place and all the ways that love keeps growing even after someone dies. I think she would be proud of what we've built together." "I think so too," Emmy replied with absolute certainty. "And I think maybe she's not really gone, just living in all the good things that came from knowing her, like how your love for her turned into love for all of us." As the sun set over San Francisco Bay and the last families departed from the community center's inaugural celebration, Masaru reflected on the strange alchemy of healing and transformation. His grief for Fumiko remained a permanent part of his emotional landscape, but it no longer defined the boundaries of his existence. Instead, it had become the foundation for understanding how precious connection was, how fleeting time could be, and how important it was to honor love by creating more of it rather than simply guarding what was lost. The community center would serve hundreds of families in the years ahead, providing education and support and gathering space for a neighborhood that had welcomed him when he most needed belonging. But its deeper significance lay in what it represented about the possibility of rebuilding life after devastating loss, of finding purpose that honored the past while embracing future possibilities. That night, as Masaru placed Emmy's celebration flower in the crystal vase beside her growing collection of paper creations, he listened to the steady ticking of the grandfather clock that now marked time, moving forward rather than backward. His penthouse no longer felt like a tomb, but it also no longer felt adequate to contain the life he was building. Somewhere in the coming months, he would need to find a home that matched his expanding capacity for connection, perhaps a house with guest rooms for visiting friends, a kitchen suitable for hosting dinner parties, a garden where paper flowers could be replaced by living ones that bloomed and grew and returned each season with renewed beauty. The transformation was complete, but the story was still being written. Every Thursday afternoon at Café Alma, every community center program, every conversation with neighbors who had become friends. Each represented another chapter in the ongoing miracle of a heart that had learned to beat again, stronger and more open than ever before. 5 years after that first paper flower, Masaru stood in the garden of his new home, a Victorian house in the Mission District, just 6 blocks from the community center and 3 blocks from Café Alma. The morning sun illuminated beds of actual flowers that he had learned to tend with the same careful attention he once reserved for stock portfolios and merger agreements. Roses climbed trellises he had installed himself, their blooms more vibrant than any paper creation, but somehow connected to those first gifts, from a wise little girl who had seen past his wealth to his wounded soul. The house itself was a radical departure from his previous living arrangements. Warm hardwood floors instead of cold marble, windows that stayed open to invite in neighborhood sounds, furniture chosen for comfort rather than design statements. The kitchen was large enough to accommodate the monthly dinner parties he now hosted for community center families, and the living room featured comfortable seating arranged to encourage conversation rather than solitary contemplation. But the most significant change was auditory, where his penthouse had been defined by silence broken only by the measured ticking of a single clock. This house hummed with the sounds of life lived in connection with others. Children's laughter drifted from the nearby playground. Neighbors called greetings across backyards. Cooking smells and music and multilingual conversations created a symphony of community that had become the soundtrack of his daily existence. Emmy, now 13 and approaching the complex emotional territory of adolescence while retaining the essential wisdom that had first drawn him to her, was a regular presence in the house. She had her own bedroom for weekend visits, decorated with artwork they had created together and books they had shared during their ongoing friendship. Their relationship had evolved as she grew. Less of the magical thinking that had characterized her younger years, more of the practical wisdom and emotional sophistication that marked her gradual transition toward adulthood. "You know what's different about you now?" she had asked him recently as they worked together in the garden, transplanting seedlings with the focused cooperation that had become characteristic of their shared projects. "What's different?" he had replied, curious about her teenage perspective on his transformation. "You don't look like you're waiting for something to end anymore," she said, patting soil around a young rosebush with gentle efficiency. "You look like you're excited about what's beginning." The observation was typically perceptive, capturing a shift he had felt but not articulated. For years after Fumiko's death, he had moved through each day, simply trying to survive until its conclusion, marking time until some undefined point when the pain would become bearable. Now his days were filled with anticipation, for community center board meetings where they would plan new programs, for dinner parties with neighbors who had become genuine friends, for gardening seasons and holiday celebrations, and all the ordinary miracles that constituted a life lived in connection with others. The community center had thrived beyond anyone's initial projections, serving not just the immediate neighborhood, but becoming a model for similar projects throughout the city. Aya had been promoted to director, overseeing a staff of 12 and an annual budget that would have seemed impossible when they first began meeting in Café Alma to discuss possibilities. Kimiko continued teaching cooking classes and cultural programs, but she had also become something like the center's spiritual advisor, offering wisdom and perspective to families navigating difficulties that ranged from immigration challenges to generational conflicts. For Masaru, the center represented ongoing proof that wealth could be transformed into something more meaningful than portfolio growth. His business interests continued to prosper, but they now operated within a framework of values that prioritized community benefit alongside profit margins. Several of his companies had relocated operations to the Mission District, providing employment opportunities for neighborhood residents, and his investment strategies increasingly focused on enterprises that aligned with his evolved understanding of what constituted success. The most profound change, however, was internal. The grief that had once threatened to consume him had been transformed into a deeper capacity for love and connection. He could speak about Fumiko now with warmth rather than devastation, sharing memories of their time together without being overwhelmed by the reality of her absence. Her photographs throughout his house were displayed not as shrine objects, but as celebrations of a love that had prepared him to recognize and receive the gifts that followed her death. On this particular morning, as he tended roses that would bloom throughout the summer and return each year with renewed beauty, Masaru reflected on the strange mathematics of transformation. One paper flower had grown into a community center, a new home, a network of relationships that provided meaning and purpose beyond anything his previous success had offered. The investment of emotional vulnerability had yielded returns that couldn't be measured in traditional financial terms, but which had proved more valuable than all his accumulated wealth. His phone buzzed with a text from Emmy. "Don't forget dinner tonight. Mama is making your favorite miso soup, and I have a new paper flower design to show you." The message made him smile with anticipation for the evening ahead. Simple family time with people who had become the most important relationships of his adult life. As he gathered his gardening tools and prepared to shower before heading to the community center for a morning meeting, Masaru paused to absorb the sounds of the neighborhood waking up around him: coffee shops opening, children walking to school, elderly residents beginning their daily routines. The sounds no longer felt like reminders of a world he couldn't access, but like the familiar rhythms of the community he belonged to, the place where his presence mattered, not because of his wealth, but because of his genuine care for the people whose lives intersected with his own. Later that evening, as he sat around Aya's kitchen table sharing homemade miso soup and listening to Emi describe her latest school project, Masaru marveled at how completely his understanding of abundance had been revolutionized. The penthouse filled with expensive art had felt empty despite its monetary value, while this modest apartment rich with laughter and conversation felt infinitely precious. His Bitcoin holdings and stock portfolios continued to grow in the background of his financial life, but the wealth that mattered most was measured in relationships nurtured, community contributions made, and love shared freely without expectation of equivalent return. "Show him the flower," Aya urged her daughter as they finished their soup, smiling at Emi's characteristic enthusiasm for her latest creative project. Emi disappeared into her bedroom and returned carrying an intricate paper construction that incorporated not just colorful papers, but also small LED lights that made the creation glow with soft illumination. The flower was sophisticated enough to serve as actual home decor, but it retained the essential spirit of her early grocery store advertisements. A gift made with love rather than purchased with money. "It's solar-powered," she explained proudly. "So it charges during the day and lights up at night. I thought maybe you could put it in your garden window, and it would remind you that some things grow stronger in the darkness." As Masaru accepted the glowing flower and felt its gentle warmth in his hands, he understood that this would join the small collection of paper creations that had marked the stages of his healing, each one representing not just Emi's artistic development, but his own gradual return to the world of the living. The grandfather clock in his Mission District home still ticked steadily, but it no longer stood alone marking time in empty rooms. Instead, it provided rhythm for a house filled with friends, laughter, shared meals, and the ongoing miracle of a man who had learned that love, once given freely, multiplied in ways that exceeded any logical projection or reasonable expectation. As he walked home that evening, carrying Emi's solar-powered flower and listening to the familiar sounds of his neighborhood settling into sleep, Masaru reflected on the profound truth that had emerged from their unlikely friendship: that healing happens not through forgetting loss, but through allowing it to transform into capacity for greater love; that abundance is measured not in accumulated possessions, but in connections generously shared; and that sometimes the smallest gestures, a paper flower given by a child to a stranger, can catalyze transformations that ripple through entire communities and change everything about what seems possible. The house that welcomed him home was bright with solar-powered flowers in every window, casting gentle light into the darkness and promising that tomorrow would bring new opportunities for growing the love that had replaced his grief, expanding the community that had become his family, and nurturing the garden that had grown from one small act of unexpected kindness. And you, wherever you're listening from, perhaps in your own empty room, surrounded by your own accumulated successes that feel somehow insufficient, or carrying your own grief that seems too heavy to transform. Have you ever encountered someone whose presence reminded you that love multiplies when shared rather than hoarded? Someone who saw past your protective walls to the heart that was waiting to heal and grow again. Maybe it was a child who asked unexpected questions or offered simple comfort. Maybe it was a neighbor who showed up during your darkest hour. Maybe it was a stranger whose casual kindness cracked open possibilities you had stopped believing existed. These encounters are not accidents, but invitations, opportunities to discover that even the most frozen hearts can learn to beat again, that even the most isolated lives can bloom into connection, that even the deepest grief can transform into capacity for joy. Masaru's story reminds us that true wealth isn't measured in Bitcoin or stock portfolios. but in the relationships we nurture, the communities we serve, and the love we give freely without calculating returns. That healing doesn't require forgetting our losses, but allowing them to deepen our appreciation for the connections that remain. That sometimes the most profound transformations begin with the smallest gestures: a paper flower, a moment of attention, an act of kindness offered without expectation. If this story has touched something in your heart, share it with someone who might need reminding that miracles still happen, that community still exists, that love still transforms everything it touches. Leave a comment about your own experiences with unexpected healing, the small kindnesses that changed your perspective, the moments when someone saw past your success or failure to the person you really were. And remember, somewhere in your life right now, there might be a child with wise eyes and a generous heart waiting to offer you a paper flower that could bloom into possibilities you never imagined. The only question is whether you're ready to accept the gift and let it grow into whatever miracle your heart has been secretly hoping for all along.